Hello, everyone. Welcome to OceanX Live. We're happy to have you with us today. I'm Micah. I'm part of the digital media team at OceanX. Our mission is to explore the ocean and bring it back to the world. And we're currently underway on an expedition in the Gulf of Aqaba. Today, we're excited to connect you with one of the scientists on that expedition. She's currently on board OceanXplorer. This expedition supports the implementation of the royal directive of His Majesty King Abdullah II to establish the Aqaba Marine Park as an international research hub and destination. Today, we're going to hear from Professor Zeinab Arabeyyat. She's an assistant professor of molecular ecology at the University of Jordan. Her research covers microplastics, water quality, nanotoxicity, genetic biodiversity, and metagenomics. And she's going to talk to us today about how her work on biodiversity at the molecular level is helping us understand and protect corals in the Gulf of Aqaba. Welcome, Dr. Zeinab.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be with you today to tell you a little bit about biodiversity in Jordan, and specifically we'll try to focus more on the genetic diversity, molecular diversity of marine species in the Jordanian Gulf of Aqaba. First of all, let me introduce myself for you. I'm Zeinab Arabeyyat, an assistant professor in molecular ecology at the University of Jordan, Aqaba branch. And currently I'm working on molecular diversity of some selected marine species. I will tell you later about some details of some of the scientific research we are currently running and we will do on the OceanX expeditions. Jordan. For who doesn't know, Jordan is a beautiful country located in Western Asia, and it's officially known as Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, but mostly known as Jordan. It's an Arab country in the Middle East. It's, as I said, it's a small country with an area of 90,000 kilometers square, but it has a great variety of wildlife. We'll try today to focus a little bit on the coastline of the Jordanian Gulf of Aqaba. As you see from the picture, the Jordanian coastline covers a small area of around like 27 kilometers of the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba. The Gulf of Aqaba actually extends around 180 kilometers from the Jordanian shore in the north to the Strait of Tehran in the south. It has an average width of 20 kilometers and average depth of almost around 800 meters. In general, the biodiversity of Jordan and ecosystem is very diverse, and usually we can divide Jordan into 4 different biogeographical zones: the Mediterranean, Irano-Turanian, Saharo-Arabian, and Sudanian. Within these diverse zones, we have around like 13 different vegetation types. All of these types actually represent different elements of flora and fauna. That leads us to the degree of variation of organisms we have in Jordan, which is called biodiversity. As you can see, so far they have recorded around 2,545 plant species in Jordan and 436 bird species, around 82 species of mammals that belong to 24 families, and almost 99 species of reptiles that belong to 18 families. Now I'll try to focus a little bit on the Jordanian coast of the Gulf of Aqaba. The Jordanian coast is extremely arid. It has a high temperature in summer and intense sunshine. So the temperature in summer, it could reach around 45 degrees. In winter, it can go down to like 14 Celsius in January. In the northern Gulf of Aqaba, seawater temperatures could range between 21 degrees in winter and 27 degrees in summer. The climate in general affected by airflows from the Indian monsoonal trough and the Mediterranean low pressure systems. We have like a low average number of rainfall in Aqaba. It's around like 35 millimeter per year. High evaporation rates of seawater. It goes up like 200 to 365 centimeter per year, comparing to the, it's very high comparing to the amount of rainfall we have. Salinity is also high with a little annual variation. As I say, the Jordanian coastline of the Gulf of Aqaba is warm, and that the benefit side of this, that we have an amazing coral reefs in Jordan. The coral reefs usually, in general, it can found in warm and shallow waters, and it have like a high biodiversity, and that's what we actually have in Jordan. The nutrients actually in the coral reefs is located in the bodies of the organisms, either living or dead organisms. And the coral reefs could also build upon the dead mineralized remains of coral remains and the live coral animals that live on the surface of the coral reefs can support a wide range of organisms. For the coral reef in Jordan, the interesting part of the coral reef in Jordan, that is, it is considered as a discontinuous series of coral reefs and reef flats, where you can never find more than 150 meter wide of coral reefs and reef flats over the length of 13 kilometers. That's because we have like a variety of rocky shore and sandy shore, rocky shore, sandy shore, reef flat, reef-based sandy bottom, and seagrass ecosystems all along the 28 kilometer of the coastline. So far for the marine biodiversity in Jordan, it have been recorded that we have around 510 marine fish species, where we have like 5% of these fish species are endemic. Around 25 endemic species are only in reefs of the Gulf of Aqaba. We have some endangered species living in the Gulf of Aqaba, including some marine turtle and some fish like Chilinus undulates. And you can see here from the pictures some of these endangered species that we have in Aqaba. We also have abundant amount of species that have high economic value, including tuna and sardine in the Gulf of Aqaba as well. Also, regarding to the coral in the Gulf of Aqaba, we have around like 270 species of coral. Around 157 hard coral species were positively identified in the Gulf of Aqaba, mostly morphologically identified. In terms of the relative abundance of the Jordanian reefs, we have like 5 most abundant fish species. As you can see, I tried to distribute it among the pictures, where you can see Pseudoanthias, Sequampians, Chromis verdias, and another interesting species that we have in a high amount in the Gulf. Regarding to the seagrass actually is considered as like a marine flowering plant with an important, which considered as an important coastline habitat. It's actually the seagrass habitat can help exchanging the nutrients and organic matter. It provides important habitat for many species in the of marine fauna and juvenile fish. Some endangered marine organisms, including the sea turtles, actually graze on these seagrass beds. That's how important it is. And in globally, it's considered as a good indicator for water equality, because seagrass beds maintain water quality and reduce turbidity through the sediment deposition. In Jordan, we have at least 3 species of seagrass that occur in the Jordanian Gulf of Aqaba: Haldo linunervis, Halophila ovalis, and Halophilus tybolacea. For the zooplankton, we have around 82 species of different mesozooplankton groups and larval stages of various other organisms that have been identified in Aqaba. Copedos are by far was the most abundant and ubiquitous zooplankton organisms. The spatial distribution of the mesozooplankton in the Gulf of Aqaba has implication for fishing ecosystem, and actually it could be used to predict if there were any pollution in the coastline or the coastal stations we have all around the Gulf. We also have a different amount of species that have been identified so far: 58 species of Sarcodyna, 72 species of Porphyra, Cnidaria, around 237 species were identified, 242 species Nematoda, and so on. Regarding to the bacteria and phytoplankton, unfortunately, we don't have that many information related to the diversity of the bacteria and phytoplankton or the biodiversity of these species in the Gulf of Aqaba. It could be due to the lack of infrastructure and the human capacity. For example, until 2014, it's been the first time Aqaba witnessed the commissioning of the first marine molecular and microbiology laboratory that belonged to the University of Jordan Aqaba branch that actually work on biodiversity studying or biodiversity surveys of bacteria and phytoplankton. Okay. Now we've talked a little bit about the biodiversity in general. When we talk about biodiversity, we are talking in general about the diversity and distribution and the amount of organisms all around us in the ecosystem. But when we go specifically to the genetic diversity of any species, or in specific marine species that we are interested in our talk here, we actually reconstruct the evolutionary history of a group of these organisms. That leads us to why it's important to talk about the genetic diversity. Genetic diversity could give us a rise to different physical characteristics to the individual, and it makes them better adapt to stress, diseases, and unfavorable environmental conditions. For the environmental changes that could happen naturally or due to human intervention that lead us to the one of the important parts of the evolution, the natural selection. It could lead to the selecting of the most suitable or most susceptible traits to stay and adapt to changes and survive for the future. The genetic diversity is also important for healthy population because it maintains different varieties of genes that could be helpful and resistant of diseases or any other environmental conditions. In general, genetic diversity can reduce the recurrence of undesirable inherited traits. So, as I said before, the biodiversity could include the diversity of species. It could also include the genetics and habitats, but there is also another source of biodiversity called molecular biodiversity. The molecular biodiversity is distinct from genetic diversity. Both depend on inheritable, the DNA of these organisms, but it occurs within one individual or between individuals of the same species, between related species, within and between phyla and ecosystems, and throughout evolution. So molecular diversity is very important in characterizing the species. It can reflect the evolutionary history of these species and the possible futures, including the ability of these species to survive the changes that we are seeing around us that related to the climate change and the quick changes that we are facing now in the ecosystem. Okay, talking about the molecular biodiversity, now that leads us to one of the scientific research that we are currently running in Aqaba. It's about molecular identification of the symbiotic dinoflagellata in corals in the Gulf of Aqaba. The objective of our research is to explore the symbiodium diversity in the corals, specifically in the Jordanian Gulf of Aqaba. We are looking at like a specific gene, the ITS regions of the ribosomal DNA. Why we investigated to see if we have any difference in within the corals in the Gulf of Aqaba that could have different zooxanthellae. I will talk a little bit about zooxanthellae on the next slide, and we want to see whether this zooxanthellae is association between zooxanthellae and corals is specific or not. Why zooxanthellae is important, and we are interested about studying the molecular biodiversity of these species. I previously told you about the coral reefs that could have harbor different species that could be helpful, including the live coral animals. For the coral reefs that covered with the colonies of different species of live coral animals, they have tentacles that could catch the plankton that are swimming all around in the water. The coral animals have these small microscopic microorganisms, protists. It's called zooxanthellae. They live inside the corals. These zooxanthellae are dinoflagellates. They are a group of protists. They are photosynthetic, so they need light. They can move through water and they called with the help of the flagella they have. The coral animals, why they are associated with these small species zooxanthellae, because the coral animals get the sugars from these zooxanthellae, and zooxanthellae actually get nutrients from corals, and they can get place to live in. This is why they are very dependent on each other. Any changes in the environment conditions could reduce this amount of zooxanthellae in the corals. If that happens, that could leave the corals unhealthy, pale, or they could lead to bleaching of corals or dying of these corals. That leads to how important it is to keep these zooxanthellae in these corals, and it's actually very important to know the type of these zooxanthellae that lives in these corals. And for example, like as I said, like there's factors could affect on the mutualistic relationship between the coral and zooxanthellae, including the water temperature, pH, nutrients, fishing practices, and others. So let's summarize why it's important to study the symbodium diversity of corals in the Gulf of Aqaba. The important thing about the coral reefs of the Red Sea, that it's considered as one of the most interesting, amazing, fascinating, diverse coral reefs in the world. It could serve as a reef refugee due to the unique suits of environmental conditions it has. We only, unfortunately, have a few studies that characterize the genetic diversity of this zooxanthellae in the Gulf of Aqaba. Our study will be one of these important studies that represent a survey of zooxanthellae from the Jordanian Gulf of Aqaba to see the variety type of these zooxanthellae in the coral species. We will identify the key refugee as a potential important for future conservation action, and it could contribute to a better understanding of the sensitivity of corals to environmental conditions. That if you compare it to what we have in other parts of countries all around the world, where they have like increasing of the bleaching of corals, we could see if the zooxanthellae we have in our coral reefs have like unique properties that could make it special, and we could understand more about why it's still survived and can handle the high temperature they have in the Gulf of Aqaba. That's like just to show you some of the sampling locations we've done so far for our study. So what we did, we chose different sites for our study to collect some coral from the coral reefs that spread along the shallow reefs of the Jordanian Gulf of Aqaba. We just went deeply up to 22 meters. So that's considered as like a shallow reef. We wanted to go deeper in the Gulf, and that was possible with the help of the OceanX, which I will tell you later how it could be possible and how it will help us. So, as I say, these are the locations that we collected our corals from depth ranged from 8 meters up to 22 meters. This is the steps we went through to study to identify the zooxanthellae we found and try to study the molecular biodiversities among it. So I'll go step by step with these methods. First, coral sampling. With the help of our divers from the Marine Sciences Station, we were able to collect different species of corals. We were able to identify some of these coral species. I will just go quickly to this slide to show you some of our samples that we've collected. These coral samples, we have lots of samples like these. As you can see, some were identified, others were still not possible to identify. We will go for molecular technique to identify the unknown corals, but the rest were morphologically identified. So these samples were collected by divers. Then for cell preparation, we took these coral fragments. Manually, we were able to extract the zooxanthellae from these corals, and we were able to see it using the microscope. And later we have used a good quality DNA extraction kits, the commercial DNA extraction kits, to extract the DNA from the zooxanthellae that we extracted. Later, we have used special primers, specific primers for the symbiotic dinoflagellata. We have used these primers to run it using the polymerase chain reaction. The PCR products we've got went for sequencing, and after sequencing, we went to alignment using blast alignments to identify the species we had. And so far we have like some interesting results, but still we need to run more samples just to be sure about the number of clades we have of zooxanthellae. After finishing the sequencing all the samples, we can go for the phylogenetic analysis, where we can study the evolution history of these species among the corals we've selected. So that's what we've done so far using the shallow shallow reefs depth samples. Later, with the help of OceanXplorer, we can go for a new expedition for a molecular identification of the symbiotic dinoflagellata in corals in the Gulf of Aqaba. The amazing things about this experience will be that we can go even deeper, the deep coral ecosystems. We can go up to 100-ish with the ROV or submersibles, these fascinating equipments they have in the OceanXplorer to collect more coral samples that we can't get with divers. And by studying these coral species and studying the zooxanthellae they have, we can go for like a whole new experience of discovering the molecular biodiversity of these species among the corals in the Jordanian Gulf of Aqaba. Our team is me, myself, Professor Fuad Al-Horani, who's a professor in coral biology and ecology, Dr. Maisa Swais, assistant professor in biotechnology, and Farah Manna, a research assistant in our work. And for any further questions, I will be happy to answer your question now. And for later, you can contact me via my email or you can tweet me on my Twitter. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Zeinab. We can open up the floor for questions now. If you're joining us on YouTube, you can put your questions in the chat. If you're part of the classroom and you're with us on Zoom, if you could use the raise hand feature and introduce yourself when you ask your question. And with that, we are ready to take any of your questions.
Thank you so much, Micah.
Thank you. I have a question to start us off, kind of a broad one. How are things going on board so far, and what kinds of work have you been doing during the science operations on board?
It's been amazing so far. We are having a lots of fun and a lots of amazing observation and samples that we've collected so far. It's been like more than 1 week. It's like up to now 8 days. And it's a short time, but full of amazing finds. So far, we were able to reach a very deep point in the Gulf of Aqaba, where we never been able to reach before. We went down to 800 meter, 800 something, 850 meter in the deep. We were able to collect some samples of corals from down to 150, 250 meter, and even 350 meters. These amazing findings were not being able to done without OceanXplorer. Also, the amazing facility they have in the OceanX in their wet lab and dry lab are fascinating, amazing, where you can do a lot of work in short time with a good quality of work.
It sounds amazing. It sounds like you're getting a lot done in a short period, and the deep samples.
Exactly, yeah.
The deep samples sound especially exciting. We have a 3-part question from Maha on YouTube. First part of the question, is there a possibility to use the molecular diversity to classify the marine organisms in Aqaba? And
yes.
Go ahead. We'll break it up into the 3 parts.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So the first part is the possibility to use molecular diversity to classify the marine organisms. And then what's the expected benefit from a molecular diversity study of coral species and their tolerance of salinity? And have we studied this for the endemic species found in the Gulf?
Okay, can I start one by one for the questions?
Sure.
So for the Okay, it's amazing questions, actually. Thank you for asking. For the first question, which is about like, are we able to study more of molecular diversity of more species in the Gulf of Aqaba? The answer is absolutely yes. For the samples we've collected so far, me and the other colleagues in the same expedition, we are able now to find more findings at the molecular level for corals, for sponge, and even for other species like microorganism, bacteria, archaea, and so on. For this to be happened, as I said, like you need a high-tech technologies, and that all exists in the OceanXplorer in one lab where you can collect the sample via ROV or submersibles equipment. In the same day, you can take these samples, start running like a processing for these samples. In the same day or the next day, you are still able to even start analyzing them. Within 2 days, you may even find the answers of your questions that what I have. The processing of the findings or the results could take a little bit time, but you could still take preliminary results that could show you what we have there. So it's been possible, and we actually start to know a little bit of what we have. We're still not having like a whole overview, but as I say, in 1 week, it's an amazing result. For the second question, would it be okay if you can repeat it for me?
Yeah, of course. So the question was, what benefit do we expect from a molecular diversity study of coral species tolerant of salinity?
Okay, so when we talk about the molecular diversity or identifying any species at molecular level, we are talking about a specific identification where you can actually know exactly what is this, what kind of this organism we have. You can also have like a sequence or a reading of the whole sequence of its DNA, where you can find like a special genes within the genomic DNA of this organism that could have like a special gene that can resist high temperature, that can resist for example, salinity. These special genes that can give this organism the ability to adapt or live in a harsh environment can help scientists later to know why some organisms can live and survive in some environments but cannot live in other environments. You can do like a comparison and like maybe later work further in making the other organisms in somewhere else able to adapt in their environment and survive and evolve even further. So it's like a continuous process, starting from knowing what we have actually in that organism, what is amazing or special in its DNA. So that can be reached by studying the DNA of this organism at molecular level.
Okay, are you ready for the third part? It was short.
Yes, please.
Just a question about, have we studied this with a focus on the endemic species that are endemic to the Gulf of Aqaba?
You mean if we already have any findings before this expedition? I
think that was the question. Has it been studied? Has it been studied for the endemic species?
As I said before, like unfortunately, we only have a few studies that actually studied selected species in Jordan in general, and a very few in the Gulf of Aqaba. So basically what we are doing now on OceanXplorer is studying what is not exist so far. So we don't have any published data, let's say, about the genetic diversity of corals or sponge or other species like shrimps or some bacteria The reason why we don't have that many findings or many studies about the genetic diversity of these organisms in Jordan is because it's not that easy actually to work on these techniques without having like a good fund and a good infrastructure. And you need also like a technician and specialized people who can actually work on molecular techniques. And that actually can't achieve that easily, and it takes a long time. But with like a good property, a good facility, and a good expert, a scientist who actually know how to run molecular experiment, scientists who can actually analyze the output of these results, we can actually achieve a good output about molecular diversity of the organisms we have. So it's a little bit long way process, but it can be achieved with what we have now and what we can achieve later, hopefully.
Wonderful. We have a little bit of a different topic from Zakaria on YouTube. Is there any ongoing research on microplastic? And if so, what does it focus on?
Okay, that's a very good question. Because I'm also running another experiment in the OceanXplorer right now by trying to find if we have any microplastic in seawater or sediments of the Gulf of Aqaba. So far, we don't have any published data about microplastic in the Gulf of Aqaba. So it's amazing that with the help of OceanXplorer, we can collect enough samples to start working on finding out if we have microplastics. So this will be like the first study to be done in Jordan regarding to microplastic.
Okay, and I have another question. The corals we've talked about are resilient to heat and some of the changes in the ocean. How did they develop that resistance over time? How did they evolve that way?
That's actually what we are trying to know, like the ability of the corals we have to adapt the temperature we have in the Gulf of Aqaba. The answer can be found in their genes, in the genetic materials of these corals and the zooxanthellae, or like the microalgae that give the life of these corals. So this is what we are trying to achieve by knowing like what's special in these corals and the zooxanthellae that living inside these corals to make it adapt. So the answer is still not known yet, but we can know it later by knowing further information about the molecular diversity. So it's still like have to be studied.
And when we talk about the resilience, how does the relationship work between the zooxanthellae and the polyp, like in terms of how they each contribute to the resilience?
Yeah, so basically the zooxanthellae, which is like a small microalgae that live inside the corals and could provide, let's say, the life of the corals by giving it the nutrients and the food it needs, and the same with the corals that can give the nutrients and a place to live for the zooxanthellae. So both, when they are associated together as in a symbiotic relationship, that means that both are still alive. And when it's the environment start to get harsh or not suitable for the zooxanthellae to stay in, raising temperature too high, or like increasing salinity or acidity of water, for example, like zooxanthellae will start leaving the corals. In this case, corals cannot depend on itself alone. So it will start like a pearl, and could by the end like lead to the bleaching of corals. Corals could die without having enough zooxanthellae to support its life. So the resilience, or like the ability of zooxanthellae to stay inside the corals, actually help it to stay alive for a long time with, and like give it these colorful corals and like the life itself.
This is another question from Maha on YouTube. how is it possible to link this research about coral tolerance to salinity and high temperatures with other regions in the world, particularly Australia, where they've had several bleaching events already?
Okay, so that's a very important question, because as I say, like so far, we don't know what type or what clades we have of zooxanthellae that make it actually special. So by knowing what type of zooxanthellae we have, we can compare it with the types of the zooxanthellae that exist in Australia or any other places. By knowing the molecular or the genetic material that have in these zooxanthellae, maybe they have that special gene that can help it to resist the changes in temperature or salinity. That can be actually be helpful later to, if we found it, that can be helpful to make a new species that can genetically modified, for example. That's like a long-term proposed research, and it could be like knowing like a new clades, a new species of zooxanthellae that can persist or handle the different condition of harsh environment. That can be helpful to understand that maybe we have something more special in the Gulf of Aqaba that can be used in somewhere else to help other corals be like recovering or like handling the environments they have in.
Does this tie into, or I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about the work that some researchers are doing to develop these super corals, and then the maybe like replanting reefs with some of the more resilient corals?
It could be, yeah. It's a high-tech technologies actually to work on modifying or like working on modifying the genetic material of some corals to make it able to persist or handle this environment. But it could be happened like in some high-tech facilities in other laboratories. But for now, we are not able to do that. Like we still need to know what actually we have, like what the type of zooxanthellae that we have. Do we actually have these special genetic materials like to work further on it in later? But it's actually being studied, but not currently here in Jordan.
I just want to make sure we're not missing any questions from our classroom. I don't see the raised hand, but if anybody does have a question, maybe if you're having a trouble with the raised hand feature, you could also stand so I can see you on camera. But in the meantime, I was curious, you mentioned earlier the impacts of fishing on the zooxanthellae coral relationship. And I was just curious, like how exactly do the nets and other fishing methods affect that?
How the fishing actually impacts?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So basically for the fishing behaviors that we have in the Gulf of Aqaba, it's actually now with the help of ASEZA, it's being controlled and regulated properly. What have been damaged before because of the behaviors of some fishers, it actually can be recovered later with time. And but it actually affected in some parts, and we were able to see some of these damages in some parts of the deep points in the Gulf of Aqaba. But for now, I think it's being regulated properly by the authorities in Aqaba, that it won't have that much effects in the future.
It looks like we have a raised hand in our classroom, so we are ready for your question if you want to make your way to the camera and the microphone.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Zeinab, for this interesting information. First, we would like you to tell us what is the difference between biodiversity and genetic diversity. And thank you.
Thank you for your question. And it's very interesting actually to explain it further, because it's have like saying diversity. Some people say, okay, what's the difference when you say biodiversity or molecular diversity? When I talk about biodiversity, I'm talking about the varieties of all organisms around us, like the animal species, plant species, all these different species around us in the ecosystem. But if I go deeply, like in more specific, when I talk about molecular diversity, it's part of biodiversity, but it's more specific because it's about the varieties or the diversity of genetics within these species. So it's more specific actually to study the differences or diversity within species when we know more about what genetics that actually make them different than each other. So biodiversity in general is like everything around you, all the organisms within one place. Genetic diversity is molecular diversity is having like just the genetic differences within selected species within these species. So it's more precise or more specific.
I just want to check to see if we have any other questions from the classroom, because we are coming up on the end of our time together. Oh, we do have another question. Hello, welcome. Sorry, could I ask you also to stand closer to the microphone so we can hear your question better?
Thank you for this sharing us this knowledge, and we're very happy to attend this lecture with you. We have a question: how can we measure biodiversity in any area?
Okay, so how can you measure the biodiversity in any place? Simply by counting how many organisms, how many different species I have in specific area. So you take this specific area, you start like counting how many plants, how many animal species do you have in this area. The higher the variety of these organisms, it means actually you have a higher diversity within this place. So this is simply how you can measure it, like by taking different area, counting how many plants, animals you have in this place.
The raised hand is turned on for our classroom, so whoever has the next question, we are ready to hear it.
Can you hear me? Hi.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thanks for this. Okay. Thanks, Dr. Zeinab and the OceanXplorer team for helping us learn more about our marine life in Aqaba. I just want to know what are the endemic species in general or in Aqaba? Endemic species.
The endemic species.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when we say endemic species, it means that like we have this species, different like some species that could live in a limited area, in like one specific area, like in mountain, but cannot live like in hills. It's where like that's how to differentiate it from other species. So endemic means that a species that can live in a specific place, specific area, in a limited area like mountain. And when I talk about the Gulf of Aqaba, when I say endemic species, endemic fish, that means it could live only in that area, but not like in the whole world.
Okay, it looks like we have another raised hand, and this will if you want to make your way to the microphone and make sure that you stand fairly close, because I think we're getting a little bit of an echo from the classroom. So that just helps us hear better as if you could stand as close as possible. And we're ready for your question.
How can we preserve the endangered species in Jordan?
Sounds like, how can we conserve the species of Jordan?
Endangered.
Okay, so how can we preserve or like our special species in Jordan or any place? It's actually can be achieved by spreading the awareness among people, especially with the youth people, like the young people like you, the children. We have to raise awareness, educated people with the importance of saving the biodiversity around us. People also have to know what kind of species actually are endangered, just to make sure that they can, like if for the fishers, for example, they have to know what type of fish are endangered to avoid fishing or catching it. And for like some habits that people around us do that can be avoided to provide a clean and a good environment around us to be suitable for continuous the surviving of biodiversity and like the for any kind of species, and especially for the endangered one.
I think that's a good forward-looking note to end on, since we're close to the end of our time. We can start wrapping up. Thank you, Dr. Zeinab, so much for sharing your work with us and your knowledge.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Yes.
I've learned so much, and I'm sure all of the students joining us have as well. And we would like to especially thank the students for joining us and for asking such interesting questions. We are so happy to have had you with us today, and we hope you'll keep up with us on our social media channels. Our handle is @OceanX. Thank you all so much, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.